Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. Continuing our lessons in cultural studies, today we will be looking at one of the key concepts that cultural studies and cultural theory uses, and that's hegemony and ideology. We will trace the development of this idea from the canonical classical Marxist thought, move on to explorations of it in 20th century Marxist critical theory via Louis Althusser, Antonio Gramsci and others, and see how the idea of hegemony and ideology helps us understand cultural formations, economic processes and the question of social order. The term ideology was originally introduced to speak about a system, a form of thinking, a set of ideas that mediate between the real material practices and conditions of life and the way people think, the way people behave and the way people act. That is, ideology was seen as something that intervenes, mediates, or maybe even work as a screen around material conditions. Now, you will very well wonder what the connection is between material conditions of existence and the way people think. This is where Karl Marx's contribution becomes immensely significant. Marx argued that our ideas, belief system, even matters of faith are determined by the material conditions of our life. By this, what we mean is, and what Marx meant was, our wage, our conditions of labor, places of life, where we live, where we work, all the factors which we normally can include under the category everyday life, ordinary forms of existence. What is the kind of work you do? What is the kind of salary you get? What are the conditions of work? Do you have enough money to spend and save? How are the health benefits of your job? And so on. So Marx was essentially arguing that ideas have a material foundation. This is an important shift in the way we conceptualize ideas, because ideas have always been believed to just emerge in your mind like that. Marx said no, that's not the case. Marx was proposing that there is an economic base and a larger ideational cultural superstructure. This is the primary binary that Marx uses. The economic base is what I have just listed as conditions of production, conditions of living, conditions of everyday life. The superstructure is what we normally identify as culture. This includes, to go back to the list I have already given you, ideas, belief systems, matters of faith, fashion and taste. What Marx was therefore doing was to propose that there is an intrinsic connection between the economic basis of a society, the economic conditions of a society, and the way people in that particular society behave and react. He qualifies this in a very important way. He says that in order to keep the social hierarchies of dominant and dominated, of underprivileged and privileged, you have to convince the working class, the labor force, the dominated, that their conditions were natural. What Marx was saying was, you cannot allow the reality of their material conditions to be registered by the dominant classes, because then they will rebel. They will say, you are not paying me enough, you are treating me badly. Instead, what you have to convince them is that their so-called material conditions are natural, preordained or predestined. How is this to be done? Marx proposed that one way in which this naturalization of the economic inequalities of society can be achieved is through ideology. Ideology, therefore, is a screen. It's some kind of camouflage for the economic basis of people's lives. We will remember Marx famously called religion the opium of the masses. It allows you to forget what you are, how much you earn, how you live, how you suffer and how you toil. Ideology, therefore, must be seen as some kind of a negative viewpoint. And Marx's contribution was to say that, oh, the labor class will remain labor class because they have never been convinced that they are exploited, dominated and insignificant. The labor class comes to believe that yes, we only deserve this. We are truly meant only for labor. You might recall that we made similar arguments in the case of gender, where gender roles were deemed to be predetermined because the women have come to believe that these are their natural roles. So ideology in the classical Marxist sense is a system whereby the dominant classes reinforce, continue and reimpose their domination by preparing a whole apparatus of thinking. This takes the form of cultural practices, which includes religion, which includes schooling and so on. So what you need to see here is that the cultural practices which we think in terms of as just entertainment or fun or leisure are actually devices through which a certain ideology is being perpetuated. So for instance, to take just one example, when you assign dolls as the appropriate toys for girls, what you are actually doing is appropriating an ideology that says girls are meant to do only the following things. This has nothing to do with their being girls or the toys being dolls. It is to do with the ideology that says, oh, for girl children growing up, these are the ideals we must inculcate. This is the kind of belief system they must possess. This is what they must grow up into. So what we are actually seeing here is that the conditions of existence, the conditions of exploitation produced within that material era, ethos, is never something we register consciously. Oh, but what is the harm in playing with dolls? That is the standard explanation or standard claim. The point Marxist cultural theory helps us see is, oh, but you see, the doll is an instrument through which the ideology is imposed. The doll by itself has nothing, but the doll comes with a whole train of ideas, what we call ideology. So when the girl child takes the doll and says, this is my doll and I play mother or I play nurse or I play teacher, the girl child is being brought up into an ideology, into a system of thinking that convinces her the natural role of the woman is to be mother, daughter, nurse or teacher. So the doll must be seen as an instrument of the ideology that enables the males in a society to ensure certain roles for the women. So ideology masks this particular system of gender roles, of labor and of inequality in terms of what people do. We should understand that the caste system or the class system or patriarchy are all instruments whereby one section of the class gets exploited. Then the question you should ask is, how come these people do not rebel? Because they have been convinced through the ideology that this is best for them. We note, for instance, Ambedkar's major argument that caste is not a division of labor alone, it's a division of the laborers. What he was pointing to was that there is a system of classification of society, of separation and segmentation of society, whereby one generates profits out of the labor of the other and the labor class is kept that way. So ideology is a system of thinking, but most importantly, ideology is an instrument through which oppression and exploitation can be implemented. Now, the masking of material conditions is crucial because otherwise the people would say, hey, you are doing the wrong thing or you are exploiting us. This argument of the ideological masking of material reality was for many later Marxist thinkers a bit too deterministic, because Marx said there is an economic base and there is a cultural and other superstructure. For the later day Marxists like Antonio Gramsci or Louis Althusser, this was a bit too deterministic, because for several of them the equation of base and superstructure was not so clearly divisible. It was not so clearly, shall we say, separate realms. More importantly, the economic superstructure, the cultural superstructure over the economic base had its own complications, and for people like Gramsci, it was very difficult to accept that the people blindly followed any ideology. Gramsci said, there is no ideology that can be 100% effective People are free to resist, rebel, or abandon an ideology. More importantly, ideology can shift over a period of time. So the ideology that helped the agrarian farmer to retain his or her control is not the same as the ideology of the capitalist owner of a factory or the service providers in the MNC now. So essentially, Gramsci was proposing that we need to rethink the idea of ideology a little more carefully, and that the control over ideology is essentially slippery. You may have control for a period of time, but there is no way you can impose ideology in such guaranteed waterproof compartments over the dominated class. Effectively, what we are saying here is ideology cannot be total. Ideology has its fractures. The distinction here that Gramsci was trying to make was between the political sphere in a society and the civil sphere. The political sphere would be of the state and the state's equipment and apparatuses, which includes the law, the economic controlling authorities, policymakers, legislatures, and executives. But civil society consists of the church, that is religion, of the education system, which includes schools and colleges, and includes also things that we never think of as apparatuses of domination and ideology, like the family. What Gramsci was proposing, and what Louis Althusser would later build on, is ideology is not necessarily imposed by the political party or the state or the legal apparatus. The ideology that enables the control of one class by another class is not necessarily done with the gun, with the threat of imprisonment. There are other ways in which ideology is pushed into the society. This is what they called hegemony. Hegemony is ideology in effect, but hegemony has a qualification. Hegemony is not necessarily done through the state. Though the state's ideology does remain effective, it is channelized, shall we say, through other means. And Louis Althusser, the Marxist writing after the 1960s and 70s, had an important variant of this model. Althusser also believed in the very powerful role ideology plays, like Gramsci before him and like Karl Marx in the beginning. But Althusser had a very specific qualification. Althusser proposed that ideology percolates down, as in the social order, through two systems, what he called the apparatuses. The ideological state apparatuses consist of the military, the police, the legal system, the government, and its attached peripheral ancillary units. But what was important for Althusser was the other kind of ideological apparatus, which consisted of civil organizations, civil society. What do we mean by this? You will recall what I said about Gramsci saying that it's not so easy to implement ideology in a 100% effective waterproof way. What Althusser said was, for hegemony to be effective, it required an almost invisible system of transmission. It required a system of transmission whereby the hegemony of a set of ideas would never be seen as hegemonic. And his example was, education and the family are two modes through which the ideas of the dominant classes are sent downward, but they never appear as though they are being imposed. To go back to the point we began with, Marx believed that the dominant classes impose an ideology on the dominated classes. With Gramsci and more with Althusser, we come to the recognition that ideology is not imposed. Ideology has what is increasingly called a trickle-down effect. It percolates downwards. It moves down slowly in things as innocent as school textbooks, the scriptures we read, the lessons we are taught, the family values that are inculcated in us. In other words, what we are looking at is the process of domination is not necessarily a violent one. It is violence, yes, but it is not violence in the sense we understand it. For example, when the state wants to impose a rule or a law, it says either you follow the law or we throw you into prison. Either you implement this rule or we impose a fine. What Althusser and Gramsci pointed to was that that's not really the only way through which ideology is imposed. Gramsci used the words coercion and consent. Coercion is the holding of a threat above the people and said either you do this or else. But consent is the most effective method through which ideology can be passed on, because we agree that this is best for us. So to take an example, the example I have already given to you, the girl child who is told, here, play with this doll. Why should I play with the doll? Oh, because you know it's interesting, it will add to the fun quotient, you will be happy doing it. So the girl child looks at the doll and says, well, you know what, I will play with it because it will make me happy and it's good, and so on and so forth. Now here what you are looking at is the girl consenting to play with it. She is not told either you play with this doll or you get whacked. She is being told you play with the doll because it is for your own good, it is good for you. And the girl says, well, if it's good for me, I would be happy to do that. Look at the education system, where we assume the students who come into class are ignorant and they must be taught certain things. We don't ask, what is it you actually know? The entire education system is premised on the assumption that the kids who come in don't know. But they do know some things. Do we ask them what they do know? What is it that they bring to the class, and what is it they bring to a text or an analysis or a process of interpretation? So you see, when the student comes into class, the student consents to be taught, like the girl child consents to play. What is important about this Marxist view of Louis Althusser and Gramsci is, consent is the more effective way through which ideology works, whether it is in the press, whether it's in the form of entertainment, whether it's in the form of family or education. To give you another example, our notions of beauty, our notions of fitness come to us through, say, films, where the representation of the film star in a particular way convinces us as that's beautiful. You see, the ideology of beauty is not imposed where the government says you should look this way. No. How it is imposed is, you know what, you might look better this way if you do the following things. So ideology and hegemony are both circulating through our minds, our consciousness and our belief systems in very subterranean ways. This subtlety is what Gramsci would call consent. We agree to the ideological formation or practices. So when we think about it, when we have an informal discussion about it, when there are preferences talked about, we say, oh, you know what, I prefer this kind of or toy or that kind of film or this music. We are actually by word of mouth circulating an ideology. We are not conscious of it. Also, because we are not imposing it, we assume it's innocent. The important thing to understand is the transmission of hegemony always works through these kind of so-called neutral or innocent media forms. Conversations, advertising, entertaining devices and entertainment like movies, sports. We do not recognize it as ideology. In other words, what we are looking at is the formation of a system of cultural values and the conditioning of our thinking without our being ever aware of it. Hegemony is the imposition of an ideology, and I'm putting imposition now in quotes, through far more subtle means, so that the dominated classes concede that this is good for them. Please remember what we began with. The labor class accepts. The question is, how does it accept? It accepts not because they are beaten into submission, but because they have conceded that this is the best thing to do. As a result of this emphasis on how the ideology is transmitted or how hegemony is imposed, Marxist literary and cultural theory focuses on the languages and discourses through which ideology and hegemony work. Let's take an instance of the colonial period. How did the colonials, small nation like England, manage to assert and retain control over millions of people in Asia? Were they better than us? Were they tougher on us? No, How it worked is what we now understand as hegemony. They spent a lot of time convincing us that their presence in our country is good for us, that we wouldn't have a country without them. Hegemony worked because they proposed that the white races are superior to the blacks or the browns, that the browns, blacks cannot rule themselves, we are incompetent, we are naive, and we have never achieved political modernity. You see, hegemony worked because a racial division was put in place and then proposed as natural. Oh, how can we rule? We need the whites to rule us. So hegemony worked because it was very effectively transmitted through literature, cultural practices, all sorts of methods. It was not, please understand this, it was not imposed at the point of a gun. It was not imposed through threats of violence. It was imposed upon us because we accepted it as a possible solution to the way we are. We accepted it saying, this is good for us. So effectively what we are saying is the language in which the discourses and representative modes through which hegemony comes would be important, and that's precisely what is often called the linguistic turn. The linguistic or cultural turn pays attention to how ideology is presented, masked, packaged for us through the system of science, through the system of language, and through the system of cultural texts. I used several examples. I used the example of the doll. The doll must be seen as a sign. The doll is a system of representation in which femininity gets coded in particular ways. To be feminine is to like dolls. Second, to be feminine is to play with dolls in certain ways. Finally, to be feminine is to eventually become something like that doll, which is the objection against, say, Barbie with that kind of waist size and the anorexic look, if you have been following the debates in the newspapers around the world for the past 10 years. The point I'm trying to make is hegemony here about the notions and normative codes of femininity are not taught in a direct fashion. They're insinuated. Our interest in cultural studies comes from our interest in popular cultural forms like dolls or movies in which these codes get coded. The role of a good mother. What is the role of a good mother? Think of this in any soap opera, in any film. A good mother is one who makes certain sacrifices, who does the bulk of the cooking and the primary caregiving, who's always forgiving and patient and tolerant. If you put them together, what exactly are you getting? You're getting a composite image of the feminine model that patriarchal society wants you to understand and, more importantly, assimilate. That is, the hegemony of gender roles, the hegemony of gender stereotypes, the hegemony of gender thinking are all given to us in the form of innocent films, quote unquote innocent, of course. So you watch the film, another film, a third film, and you say, that's the kind of woman I need to be if you're a girl. Because for several years this is the model that is being given to you. For feminist studies in cultural studies and in media studies like Van Loonen's work, and you see several of these writers commenting on this kind of semiotics of the sign, these representations are therefore extremely dangerous because they naturalize the ideology hidden in them. To put it another way, the ideology of this is never seen as an ideology. It's only seen as quote unquote fun or entertainment. So what we need to understand is, for cultural studies, the decoding of the language of hegemony is essential to get at what the exploitative power relations are. To summarize it briefly, culture studies, as you know, is interested in power and culture. In our interest in hegemony and in our interest in ideology, we look at the forms ideological representations take. We look at how quote unquote innocent representations actually mask existing social material conditions. We look at the fact that these representations conceal the exploitative nature of the social order, the unequal nature of gender, caste or class. It naturalizes these relations. What is important for culture studies is therefore to reveal the ideology in any representation, often called in culture studies the politics of representation. What's important to understand is unless we tackle the question of hegemony, we do not understand how society gets organized. Primarily because we assume that we think naturally. We believe because we believe. But no, we need to understand that belief systems like thought processes are inculcated in us through a very elaborate process. The ideological apparatuses of the family, the textbook, the game, the entertainment are methods through which hegemony is internalized. And when we have internalized it, we end up perpetuating them. We end up playing the roles that the dominant classes and the unequal social systems expect us to play. Thank you.